Welcome, Motorcycle.com viewers, to the beautiful sunny Jerez circuit in the south of Spain. We are here for the launch of the 2020 Yamaha YZF-R1 and R1M. If you remember, this generation of the R1 came out in 2015. 4 years on, there's new Euro 5 regulations, and the old bike, I guess, just didn't meet those rules. So with the new R1, Yamaha has found a way to not only comply with those regulations, but also make one hell of a ripper of a 1000cc motorcycle. Let's go take a look at the bikes behind me, see what Yamaha did to make the bike compliant. There it is, the 2020 Yamaha YZF-R1 cross-plane crankshaft engine. That's a mouthful, but if you know the R1, you're familiar with the engine. The offset firing order of the cross-plane crankshaft, Yamaha says, provides better feel to see what the tire is doing underneath you, just better feel for the engine character overall, so you have more communication with the bike and the throttle. For 2020, the engine pretty much stays the same, but to meet the Euro 5 regulations, a lot of the change comes in the cylinder head area. So here's a list of things Yamaha did to make the R1 engine Euro 5 compliant. Let's go down the list here. It's the same 998cc displacement as before, so to make it compliant, you need better combustion, more efficient combustion. To do that, the cylinder head and intake layout's been changed a little bit. The intake ports were shortened, and the intake volume is reduced by 12% after the throttle valve. The fuel injector is now on top of the throttle body instead of below. The injector itself is now a 10-hole injector from 12 before. And now the injection spray is angled more towards the intake valve, than it was before. On the cylinder head itself, the cooling passages have been increased on the exhaust port side for better cooling. So the finger follower valve design, valve actuation, allows for higher RPM, higher sustained RPM, which will also help in racing purposes too. Oh look, there's Michael Vandermark. Hey Michael Vandermark. So the new rocker arm shape helps it be more stable at high RPM. There's also a new camshaft profile with same valve lift with a little bit longer overlap. On the exhaust side of things, the catalyzers are moved more forward to help it warm up faster and to help burn off gases quicker. And then inside the engine, the stuff you can't see, there's a new oil pump there's a whole list of things they did with the oil pump. I'll get to the basic points of it. So when you go from full throttle to then get off the throttle, the oil passages, reducing the size of those passages, reducing the size of the piston cooling nozzles just a little bit, because it's flowing enough oil anyway. So when you go from full throttle to off throttle, that reduction in the passage size allows the engine to retain more oil, especially when you get from full throttle to off throttle. So you get better lubrication, more sustained lubrication compared to before. So less oil starvation, especially when you go from high RPM to low RPM. And then, the R1 is largely similar to what we had before. Magnesium wheels, magnesium gas tank, KYB fork, KYB shock. But the interesting thing with the fork and the shock settings, they have been revised a little bit. The spring rates are slightly decreased. So of course, the internal valving has been slightly changed compared to before to cope with these new fork spring settings. On the shock side of things, the preload and just little internal valving things have been changed to better match the different feel you get from the fork. On the front of the bike, the brakes, which always get a bad rap on the R1 for being a little bit vague. The caliper is the same, but Yamaha has put a different brake pad to try and get more feel out of the front brake lever. They say the initial bite's the same, but the braking power is a little bit stronger than before. Moving on to other parts of the bike, the main thing to know here is that the electronic system is largely the same. You still have the 6-axis IMU with traction control, slide control, launch control, wheelie control. They have taken away the unified braking because they found that it wasn't a very popular thing. So the unified braking is gone. An interesting but maybe not appreciated change, I'll say, is the ride-by-wire throttle that you see here is now completely cableless. Before, on the previous R1, the ride-by-wire throttle, the actual throttle was connected to a cable down to an ECU module. Now, this is a true cableless ride-by-wire system. The resistance on the throttle itself is controlled from a pair of magnets that help, I guess, give that feel back of your traditional throttle cable. As for the TC settings themselves, they've been slightly tweaked. The algorithms have been slightly tweaked a little bit. You know, it's been 4 years since the first version of this bike was released, so technology, algorithms, those are always improving and the technology is always getting better. So slight tweaks to the algorithms there. But otherwise, it's largely the same thing from before. So that is the R1 in a nutshell. Now let's bring our attention to the R1M, the bike you see before us here. Obviously, the biggest difference between the standard R1 and the R1M comes from the electronic Öhlins suspension. That in itself has been revised quite a bit, actually. The spring rates, the internal valving from the fork and the shock are both different compared to the previous R1M. Not by a lot, but still a subtle difference. To cope with that, the algorithms for the electronic damping have also been revised a little bit. What's cool about the new Öhlins fork, the pressurized gas chamber that you see right there is now integrated into the fork body itself. So it's safer, it's more direct, it's more secure. Yamaha says it's the first time a production motorcycle has come such equipped with pressurized gas chamber integrated into the fork body like you see here. Then if you look a little bit higher up to the bodywork, you'll see the R1M badge there. You'll also see, I hope you can see anyway, the carbon fiber bodywork, a nice distinguishing feature for the R1M. The bodywork itself, it's a good point to make. The R1 and the R1M both get slightly different aerodynamic bodywork. Yamaha says it's actually improved the aero by a few percentage points, so it's actually, slipperier? It flows through the air with less drag than before. And so other electronic goodies, both bikes get the quick shifter both up and down. That's a nice feature too. You can see up here the adjusters, electronic adjusters for the suspension, for the fork anyway. Both bikes get a new engine brake management system. Move on from there and there's a new brake control system with 2 modes. It functions off of the IMU to control the ABS and how it intervenes. The brake control 1 system is the same as the old bike, so it uses the IMU and the settings to determine how much ABS to use. It's a fairly non-intrusive system, especially for a street rider. Track riders might find it a little bit interrupting. Speaking of the street riders though, the brake control 2, the ABS sensitivity increases with how much lean angle you have and the slip rate data that the IMU can sense and send back to the ECU. So that wraps up a wonderful day at Jerez aboard the 2020 Yamaha YZF-R1 and the R1M. As you can probably see, it's not a brand new bike. It's not a revolution. It's more of an evolution of an already good bike from the chassis that started on the 2015 R1. Man, where do I even start with this? Back in 2015, I loved the R1 when this style first came out. The way I can explain it is, everything starts with the engine, right? That cross-plane crankshaft engine. There's just such good feel between your throttle hand and the back tire. Like, you feel exactly what the bike is doing underneath you. I mean, I was on some pretty worn tires on the standard R1 by our last session of the day on this bike, and I'm coming into a fast turn and I get on the gas and the back end does a pretty good slide on me, but I could feel it through my hand, and so I'm like, okay, this is a pretty big slide, but let's dial it back a skosh, and everything came back in line and it was easy breezy, everything was good, which also speaks to how good the electronics are on the R1 and the R1M. The traction control, it's amazing. Like, we've come into an age now where the electronics are an integral part of motorcycling, and it just makes the whole experience easier for 99% of riders out there. If you're that 1% of rider who is like the top echelon motorcycle racer, sure, you could probably turn it all off and do 1 lap faster than anybody else. But then try doing that for like the 20-lap race with no TC, with no help at all. If you can do it, then you're, a superhero. But the electronics on these bikes makes going faster, longer, easier. And for the bulk of us, that's magic right there. So going back to the standard R1, actually this kind of applies to both bikes, but we'll start with the standard R1. It feels really good on its side. There's a lot of feedback when you're leaned over, and you know what the back tire is doing on the gas. But the suspension too, there's good feedback from both ends. We only got 3 sessions on both bikes, and I was sharing the bike with another journalist, so making changes to the settings was kind of difficult because we would have had gone back and forth. But even with the standard settings they put us on, it's surprisingly, a capable handling motorcycle. It feels lighter than its 458, I think, curb weight listing would indicate it would feel like. Yeah, all the hype right now is about the Panigale R from Ducati or the Aprilia RS V1100, which are fantastic bikes in their own right, but, the R1 is definitely one of my favorite leader bikes and definitely my favorite Japanese leader bike on the market today. If I do have a gripe, it's the brakes. They changed the pads to give you more feel at the lever, and you do get more feel, but it's not quite as strong as I'd like, especially that initial bite. If you're familiar with the R1 and how all the gauges and buttons work, nothing's really changed there. But overall, the standard R1 on its own is a fantastic leader bike. Jumping now to the R1M, I think all of those things I mentioned about its handling characteristics and whatnot from the standard bike all carry over to the M model. The biggest difference that I found with the M model was the active suspension adjusting throughout the lap. Hard braking, where the standard model would just dive under brakes, I could feel the M model adjusting and providing more feedback and more give and more resistance hard on the brakes. And so once I tip in for the corner, I feel just a little bit more confident in where that front end is exactly placed. And once I get on the gas, same thing with the anti-squat properties in the back. When I get on the gas, I can feel a better transition of weight and power going to that back tire compared to the standard model. Of course, we're talking little differences here, but on the racetrack, little differences are enough to either win or lose a race. Well, of course, too, there's the GPS data logging equipment that you can track your lap and stuff on on an iPhone or an Android or a tablet. If you really like that stuff, maybe the R1M is your flavor, but then again, there's third-party devices and software that lets you do that same thing for less money. Otherwise, though, that's probably the biggest difference, and probably rightly so, the biggest difference you actually feel riding the two back to back is the active suspension on the M model working constantly throughout the lap to provide the support and the leverage and the feedback that's just, an nth degree better than the standard model. So then comes the issue of pricing. Well, nearly $17,000 for the standard model. It's like $9,000 more for the M model. Oof. Is the M model really worth $9,000 more than the standard? I don't know. As much as I like this electronic suspension, I don't know I could justify that cost. I'm sure I can make the standard suspension work pretty darn well for track usage, which is really what these bikes are meant for. So personally, unless you really like the way the carbon fiber bodywork looks, unless you like the Öhlins suspension and just like the overall feel of the R1M, $9,000's a big ask. I'm not sure I could pony up that difference in cost for the M model. It's a great bike, but yeah, I would personally probably go with the standard model, do the upgrades I want to do, mainly to the suspension, and then pocket all the rest of that money for tires and track days and race fees and whatever else. So the key takeaways here, both models, R1, R1M, great handling bikes. I got my elbow on the ground easily. It was a confidence-inspiring motorcycle. You know what that front end is doing. It's very confidence-inspiring on its side. R1M, you can feel the suspension giving you a lot more feedback and compliance. Standard model, that connection with the throttle and the back tire is superb. The power itself, it's strong. It's 1,000 cc strong, of course. Maybe I'm just getting used to the power these bikes make. It's not as overwhelming as I thought it would be. Maybe because of that cross-plane crank, gets that power on a lot softer than your big bang engines. But overall, it's an easy leader bike to ride fast. And man, Yamaha, you nailed it, man. This is a really cool, really fast, really fun, really capable sport bike. So that's basically my thoughts on the R1 and the R1M. Be sure to go to Motorcycle.com to read my full review there. If you have any questions, be sure to type something in the comments below. I'll try and answer as many as I can. Leave me a comment, click like, subscribe, all that good stuff. And of course, thanks for watching, and we'll see you later.